The HOA was always a problem, but I tried to ignore it until one day I came home and found all my trees destroyed. No warning, no permission, no explanation. They had invaded my property and cut everything down. The HOA president, an arrogant woman who thinks she runs the neighborhood, smiled and said it was to maintain community standards. But what didn't she know? I'm a federal judge, and now she is about to learn what happens when you break the law in front of the wrong person. I always knew that the HOA in my neighborhood was a problem, but until that day they had never directly messed with me. I saw the complaints from the neighbors, the little dictatorships that the HOA president imposed on the community, and I preferred to stay away. Not because I was afraid, far from it, but because I knew that if she came after me, she'd be playing with fire. The problem with the people is that they never know when to stop. I was proud of my property. My yard was surrounded by old, well-kept trees planted decades before, by generations gone by. They were part of the land's identity, offering shade, beauty, and privacy. When I bought the house, I made it clear that I wanted no interference from the HOA. I paid cash without the need for financing or permits, and I never signed any contract forcing me to follow the association's absurd rules. But that never stopped the woman from trying. Ever since I moved in, she's always had a way of nudging me. First there were the polite letters suggesting that I should remove elements outside the community standard. Then came the aesthetic violation notices for the simple fact that my trees didn't match her vision of a perfect neighborhood. I, like any sensible person, threw all these cards in the garbage can, and then one day I came home from work and almost didn't recognize my own house. All my trees had been cut down, not pruned, not adjusted, knocked to the ground. The yard that had once been covered by a green barrier now looked like an abandoned lot, with tree stumps scattered around like tombstones of something that should never have been destroyed. The smell of freshly cut wood was still in the air. My first reaction was absolute shock. This couldn't be real. Who the hell would have the nerve to break into private property and destroy something like that? But when I saw a pickup truck parked on the street with the HOA logo emblazoned on the side, it hit me. It did it. The HOA invaded my land and simply decided that those trees no longer had the right to exist. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't ordinary anger, it was a specific kind of fury that chilled down your spine, that only comes when you realize that someone has crossed the line and now you're going to have to deal with the consequences. And who better to deal with that than a federal judge? The feeling of looking at that scene of destruction was something I couldn't describe. The place that used to be a peaceful green patch of my house now looked like a battlefield after a bombing. It was personal. It wasn't just careless pruning or a miscommunication. It was a direct attack. The HOA wanted to prove a point, wanted to teach me a lesson, but they chose the wrong person to do it. I took a deep breath, mentally counting to 10 so as not to make an impulsive move. I knew exactly how to destroy this woman, and it wouldn't be by shouting in the middle of the street. I would do it the right way, but first I wanted to hear it from her. I turned to the HOA truck, which was still standing in the street like a war trophy, and walked over to it, and there she was. The woman got out of the passenger seat as if she had been expecting my outburst, with a satisfied little smile on her face and her hands folded as if she were about to explain some absurd rule to me. "I'm so glad you're here," she said with that feigned tone of sympathy. "We were just adjusting the aesthetics of the community. Your trees weren't up to HOA standards." I stared for a few seconds, letting the silence W me down. She wanted an emotional reaction. She wanted me to yell, to make a scene, to give her a reason to make me the problem, but I just smiled. "I get it," I replied calmly, "so let me get this straight. You came onto my property without permission and cut down my trees because you thought they weren't in compliance." She blinked a few times, surprised by my controlled reaction. I could see her confidence wavering, but she soon regained her pose. Not quite. The HOA has authority over the aesthetics of the neighborhood, and your trees were out of line with the established standard. Everything was done to maintain community harmony. Harmony. Always that word, always used by people who want to control everything around them. I nodded slightly as if considering her words. Good, then you won't mind if I take it to court. Then you won't mind if I take this to court. The change in her expression was almost instantaneous. The smile disappeared, replaced by a confused, then suspicious look. Court. She tried to laugh, but her voice came out a little sharper than before. There's no need to take it to that level. It was a simple decision by the HOA within our rights. I stepped forward, looking directly into her eyes. I'm a federal judge. Her face paled instantly. I could have filmed that moment and watched it on replay for the rest of my life. The confident posture wilted. The hands that had once been firmly crossed now loosened and fell to the side of her body. What? And you committed trespass. You damaged private property without authorization. This isn't just an administrative error by the HOA, it's a crime. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. For the first time she realized the size of the problem she had gotten herself into. I turned away without saying another word and went into the house because I already knew exactly what was going to happen next. I came home feeling a different kind of adrenaline rush. It wasn't anger, pure and simple. It was that cold, meticulous energy of someone who has already won a battle before it has even begun. The HOA may have thought it ran the neighborhood, that it was untouchable, that it could do whatever it wanted, but what that woman didn't know was that she had just messed with the one person who could legally crush her. Without breaking a sweat, I sat down at my office desk and began to organize what I needed. The first thing was to gather evidence of the invasion and destruction of my property. I pulled up the recordings from the security cameras. Every tree being cut down, every HOA truck entering without permission. The images were clear. They weren't just removing vegetation, they were deliberately destroying my property. Then came the legal part. As a federal judge, I knew exactly where to look for the HOA's faults, and that's where it got interesting. I did some research in the city's public records and confirmed what I already suspected. My house was not legally under the HOA's jurisdiction. In other words, not only were they trespassing on private property, but they had no authority whatsoever to touch anything there. What's more, in my state, removing trees without permission can lead to fines of tens of thousands of dollars depending on the size and age of the trees, and some of mine were over 50 years old. The HOA was screwed, but I wasn't going to stop there. I started digging into the HOA's financial reports. I knew that there were rules for the use of the money collected from residents, and I also knew that many of these associations commit small frauds. Herein they're the problem. This HOA wasn't just committing petty embezzlement. The transactions made no sense. Huge payments for landscaping services that were never carried out, transfers to personal accounts, absurd amounts being charged to residents with no clear explanation of where they were going. The money was simply disappearing, and who was signing off on all these transactions? The same woman who destroyed my yard. I had enough to destroy this HOA from top to bottom. But before taking legal action, I decided to test the water ears. Over the next few days, I waited to see what their next move would be. The woman didn't have the audacity to show up in person, but I tried not to laugh when I received a letter from the HOA. It was a festival of lame excuses. They claimed that the trees were old and posed a risk, that it was all a misunderstanding, and that they regret any inconvenience. The best part, at the end of the letter there was a warning that I could be fined if I tried to plant new trees without HOA approval. They still thought they were in control. I kept the letter with a smile. It would come in handy in court, but before filing I wanted to give them a taste of their own poison. I started talking to The neighbors, the ones who were already unhappy with the HOA, I called some of them to my house for an informal chat and showed them what I had discovered. The fraud, the embezzlement, the arbitrary decisions, the shock was immed. That explains why the HOA never has money for anything, one of the neighbors said, staring in disbelief at the financial reports. They raise our fees every year, but we never see where that money goes. Another resident added. The revolt began to grow that same day. Some of these people started pressuring the HOA to explain where the community's money was. And the woman, well, for the first time, she didn't know how to answer, but I had even started playing my cards. Yet now it was time to take it to a level she never thought possible. Over the next few days, I watched the HOA begin to crumble like a condemned building. The neighbors' revolt grew by the day. The conversations in the neighborhood were no longer about trivial everyday problems, but about the missing money and the president's abuses of power. The woman who used to walk around the neighborhood like a queen, giving orders, now avoided even leaving the house. She knew that the siege was closing in, but her problem I hadn't even started yet. I knew exactly how to destroy the HOA the right way. First, I filed an official complaint with the town hall about the illegal removal of the trees. This led to an environmental investigation, and soon the inspectors were in my yard taking photos, analyzing the damage and calculating the size of the fine. They confirmed that the tree could not have been removed without authorization and that the HOA would be held responsible. I then forwarded all the documentation of the financial fraud to the government's auditing department. As a federal judge, I knew exactly how to file the complaint in the most efficient way possible, and when those reports got into the right hands, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire. But the most satisfying part was yet to come. The final blow. The HOA, in desperation, called a meeting to try to calm the residents down. One last pathetic attempt to pretend that everything was under control, and I of course made a point of being there. The meeting took place in the community's small events room. The atmosphere was heavy with dozens of residents standing around waiting for explanations. The woman stood up, trying to maintain her pose, but her nervousness was visible. She knew she was in front of a mixed tribunal. She started talking about administrative errors, about how some funds may have been mismanaged, and tried to blame operational challenges for the lack of transparency. It was a pitiful attempt to avoid responsibility. But when she finally tried to talk about the trees, I decided it was time to end the theater. I stood up. The silence in the room was immediate. Do you want to talk about the HOA funds? Fine, let's talk about them. Let's talk about them. I put a stack of documents detailing the financial misappropriations on the table. Here are all the suspicious transactions made over the last 2 years, money going into accounts that have nothing to do with neighborhood maintenance payments to companies that don't even exist, and all signed by you. She turned pale, and while we're on the subject of illegalities, I continued, picking up the copy of the town hall report. Report here is confirmation that the trees were removed illegally. The government is already involved, and the HOA will face a fine of thousands of dollars. The room exploded. The residents started shouting. They demanded explanations. They demanded justice. Some were already talking about suing the HOA individually for misuse of money. There was no way out, and then came the moment I had been waiting for. Her phone rang. She answered it, her face already upset. It didn't take long for everyone to see the terror spreading through her expression. The HOA was officially under investigation. The government had frozen the association's funds, and a lawsuit was being filed against the administration. She lost everything right there in that instant. The HOA was dissolved weeks later. The residents, now free of that nightmare, elected a new group to manage the neighborhood, this time without abuses of power. And the woman, well, she disappeared off the map. Her house was hastily sold, and according to rumors she moved to the other side of the country. To avoid public humiliation I stayed exactly where I was, because in the end I didn't have to shout, I didn't have to threaten, I didn't have to stoop to her level. I just did what I always do best. I used the law against those who think they're above it, and now every time I look at my devastated yard, I don't feel angry, because I know that in the place of the trees they destroyed, something much greater was born: justice. And don't forget to leave your like and comment.